Everyone. It's so good to see so many people here. I'm really, really happy, and I am just so excited. I think it's such a privilege to have Dr. Ousman Kobo with us today. Dr. Kobo is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Center of African Studies at The Ohio State University. With Ohio State since 2006, Dr. Kobo's research and teaching interests include 20th century West African social and religious history, contemporary Islamic history, Sufism, Islam under French and British colonialism in Africa, and the social history of West African migrants in the United States. Dr. Kobo has received prestigious awards and grants to support his scholarly work, including the MacArthur Fellowship for International Peace and the Boren Fellowship. He was also recognized by the College of Arts and Sciences at The Ohio State University with the 2021-2022 Susan M. Hartman Mentoring and Leadership Award. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a master's degree in international relations, and a bachelor's degree with honors from the City College of New York. And he's also from the Bronx, which is why I really invited him, right? Why don't you join me in welcoming Dr. Kobo today?
Thank you very, very much. I am honored to be with you, to spend the next hour and a half with you.
And so today, we want to talk about religions in Africa. So just some beginnings. Can you tell us what is the earliest religion in Africa?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. But I think I should introduce myself just a little bit more so that you would understand where I'm coming from when I talk about religion. I was born and raised a Muslim, and I continued to practice Islam. I'm one of the community leaders of West African Muslim communities here in Columbus on the Far East side. Just a little bit about my growing up and education. I am one of the few fortunate students who happened to have experienced different faiths at different times in their lives. I attended Presbyterian primary school, and then I went to Anglican middle school. Then I went to Catholic high school. Very few people were that lucky. In all these instances in my life, my friends were Christians. In fact, when I was in high school, my closest friends were members of the Pentecostal evangelical movement. They called themselves born-agains, and I called them born-again. They attempted to convert me unsuccessfully. But in the course of all of this, I learned the Bible from cover to cover. I had to pass Bible knowledge courses, which was required at each and every level that I went to. In the Catholic school that I attended, it used to be a seminary. Because there was no high school or secondary school in that area, the government forced them to open it up and convert it into a high school. And I happened to be among the very, very few, if not the first, Muslim to be admitted. So you can imagine living in an environment that used to be a seminary with all the Catholic brothers and sisters, and the nuns were very good at me. They treated me very well. They disciplined me. So if I embody any form of discipline, I think I owe it to my Catholic nuns, whom I call my moms. Just to take the story a little further back, when I was born, my mom was sick. She passed away when I was only 3 months old. Before then, many of her friends were Catholic nuns at a hospital called St. Dominic. So when my mom passed away, they made an effort to snatch me from my grandmother. One of the nuns, I vividly remember her name, was Fatima. And when I gave birth to my first daughter, I named her Fatima. And I told her that's my second mom's name.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you tell us about just the earliest religions in Africa?
So to respond to that question, when I teach history, at OSU, I teach history of Islam in Africa, I teach history of Christianity. I seldom, hardly teach history of indigenous African faiths. And the reason is that it is very complex. But in terms of order, I would say African indigenous practices existed throughout Africa before the arrival of the monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in that order. So I would say the earliest faith in Africa is indigenous faith. But what do we mean by indigenous faiths? African religions are very diverse and pluralistic. There isn't one single African religion. There isn't one single African indigenous faith. African religions can be classified at different levels. One is at the level of individuals, where an individual encounters or acquires a relationship or establishes a relationship with a spirit. And that spirit becomes their friend, a guardian, right? That is at the individual level. At another level, which is the family level, a family, since the time of the ancestors, might have their own belief system or a deity that the family recognizes and worships. That is at the family level. It goes further up to the kinship level or the lineage level, where the lineage establishes a specific ritual that is observed by the entire lineage wherever you are, wherever the individual is found. We go further up to the community level of faith. And that is a faith observed by the entire community, usually once a year or more than once a year at specific times. What does the community level faith do? They promote morality. They solve material problems, such as when there is a drought. It is the god or the deity at the community level that is responsible for overcoming that calamity. That community deity transcends the other deities, that of the lineage or the individual. But there's also another layer above that of the community, which is the societal deity. The societal deity we may call the second rank from the highest cosmology, if I may use the word cosmology here. Finally, then there is the larger sphere, larger cosmology, where individuals do not go. It is that type of cosmology, the highest, that might be equal to the God of the monotheistic faiths, the omnipotent God. So many African languages have a name for this omnipotent God, a name that is not shared with any other deity. It's unique. In my language, for example, that God's name, Wende, is not shared with any deity. When you hear that word, you know it is referring to the highest deity, which in monotheistic faith we'll call God, right? But in most African religions, that highest God is not worshipped. They stay away from it. It is so powerful. It's the God of the wind. It's the God of fire. It's the God of everything. You don't go to that God without proper training. So they stayed away from that God. The mediums of all the other sectors deal with their level, but the higher God is left alone. Because they believe the highest God had delegated the power of God to the other smaller deities. And therefore, the smaller deities are the intermediaries. But if you want me to complicate that aspect of the history further, below that supreme deity is the level of the ancestors. Good ancestors in most African cultures, the good ancestors, that is ancestors who had lived to the utmost morality, being fair, being just, lived very well. When they die, they go to a level that is closer to the supreme deity, but they don't worship the deity. So when a family is in trouble or a community is in trouble and the other deities have failed to solve the problem, they call upon their ancestors. But they don't worship the ancestors.
That's wonderful. Can you tell us some of the customs and rituals of the indigenous religions?
Very good question. Again, there isn't one single ritual. Every community or at every level, there is a relationship that existed. That relationship is a relationship of reciprocity, right? It's a relationship between a community, I'm going to use the community here, between a community or a society and a spirit that has the power to do what is invisible. So what they do in terms of this reciprocity is that that deity or spirit receives some gifts, sometimes animals are slaughtered on their behalf. For the most part, when one goes back to look at African religion, many of the African religions, blood tends to be one of the main gifts that is given to a higher spirit, except God, of course, who could not be reached, and except also the ancestors who did not need that kind of intercession, right? But they do rituals of praying. Sometimes they burn fire and they sit around the fire and they glorify the spirit. It all depends on what that spirit wants from humans. And the spirit, therefore, shapes what kind of ritual that pleases them.
Interesting. So, you know, Muslims have a tradition of worshiping as a community on Fridays, Jews on Saturdays, Christians on Sundays. Do the indigenous religions have a time of the week where they gather? And maybe in your own community, what do those rituals and customs look like? And do you have like a holy leader or a priest or a, yeah?
Thank you very much for that question. It allows me to fill in some gaps. Indeed, most African indigenous faiths do not have a selected day that they worship comparable to the monotheistic faiths. But for the most part, rituals are done based on specific demands. In addition to the daily rituals or the weekly rituals that they do, they also observe specific rituals for a specific event. So let's say there is drought. They may call upon the spirit to help bring the rain. And during that time, they may be repeating the same rituals until the spirit or the deity accepts their prayers and then brings down the rain. Having said that, I often tell my students, I ask them, why do you think Africans embraced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam when it came to them? The question might seem a little simple, but it's very complicated. I always end up with the answer that the reason why Africans embraced, and by the way, today, both Islam and Christianity are growing very fast in Africa. In fact, the statistics indicate that Africa is the territory of the fastest growth of the Christian faith. Christianity is growing faster in Africa than in your America and in your Europe. You know why? Because Africans have always been attached to some form of spirituality. No matter what an African does, for the most part, even those of us who have become modern, we don't discard our relationship with the Supreme God. So why Africans embrace Christianity? Most earlier textbooks would argue that Islam was forced on Africans at the point of the sword. That is old, wrong history. In fact, there's no evidence anywhere in Africa, in the exception of North Africa, and here I will explain, where Arabs conquered Muslims and dominated their faith. It just never happened, historically. And I've proven this everywhere I was challenged. Northern Africa, from Egypt all the way to Morocco, was different because that territory came with the expansion of the Muslim armies from Arabia into North Africa. But even then, we have to make a distinction between conquest and conversion. Two different processes. One process, we conquer you. The other process is you develop the faith. You accept the faith as you deem it fit. In Africa, for the Islam, let's stick with Islam for now, most of the conversion were done by local Muslim elites and scholars who embraced the faith and saw it as part of their responsibilities to spread it. So Africans embraced Islam. It was not imposed on them. This is also true about Christianity. I've had my students saying, well, Europeans dumped Christianity on Africans. I said, be careful. You're a historian. You need to prove it. Where is the evidence? The fact that Europeans conquered some African territories and colonized those African territories does not mean that they imposed Christianity on Africans. In fact, many Christian many Christian administrators prevented Christian missionaries from spreading their faith in other territories, including Muslim-dominated territories. There is something we call the anti-clericals, which missionaries called colonial administrators, who were not allowing them to expand into some localities, right? They called them anti-clerics, that they were not good Christians. So one had to be careful.
You know, you hit on something interesting in the Christian world, which is and we've spoken about this as a group, there's been a significant decrease of believers, people believing in faith in Western Europe and North America. And then there's a rise of Christianity in Africa, in Asia, like China, and in Latin America. And so there seems to be a transition happening in Christianity. Maybe you want to share something about that?
Well, that is a very interesting observation. I usually tell my students who profess to be Christians that Africans, in particular, are bringing Christianity back to Europe and our North America. That Africans, wherever they go, they establish churches, right? If you walk around Columbus, I sometimes give my students assignments to survey African Christian churches here in Columbus, and there are a lot of them. Even though they establish those churches for their own community, they attract other non-Africans to those communities. When one looks at the Pentecostal evangelical movement, it's growing very fast in Africa and in Asia, precisely because of their liberation theology and the theology of capitalism. They promote health, they promote wealth, acquisition of wealth. They don't frown upon wealth, go for wealth. And you can see the priests, very flamboyant, right? And societies where people have felt economically dislocated, right? The church tends to fill that void. And when they come to North America or Europe, they revive or establish their faith, which embraces people in the community as well.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned about an increase of non-Africans entering the churches there. Here in the United States, like say the Catholic Church, right? There's been such a significant drop of vocations that we're seeing an increase of African priests coming in to the United States. I see that all around the Columbus area. Yes. It's interesting. So let me ask you about Christianity and Islam, the two largest religions in Africa. It seems that since the early 1900s, as there's been a decolonialization of Africa, there's been an increase of Christianity and Islam. Mm-hmm. Can you share a little bit about that?
Thank you. I would say the growth of both Muslim and Christian populations actually began during the colonial period. Because during the colonial period, as part of the struggle against European colonialism, many Africans broke away from the established churches, Methodist, Anglican, you name them, to establish their own churches. And this began from around 1920. So missionaries brought the faith to some parts of Africa, and then Africans grabbed it and took it to the rural areas. So the growth actually began when Africans broke away from the churches. And of course, they were embraced. We have examples in West Africa, we have examples in Central Africa, we have examples in East Africa. However, just before independence, Christianity, I'm focusing on Christianity for now, Christianity happened to be one of the discourse of liberation, right? One of the discourses of liberation struggles against European colonialism. Many African clergies were directly involved in the freedom, liberation, decolonization of their societies. And those missionaries, black missionaries, we call them prophets, we call them evangelicals, all kinds of names, right? They were recognized by their own people, and in areas where there were already some Christians, you see a fast growth. The other aspect of the growth, of course, happened when, after independence in the 1960s, the leaders of independent Africa failed to fulfill the dreams of their citizens of the liberation. They failed for very complicated reasons. They failed to promote wealth. They failed to provide education. Most of the promises they made during the struggle for liberation were unfulfilled. And many drove into the churches where they sought comfort, where they sought meaning to life. That is also, by the way, true about Islam. European colonialists earlier made attempt to obstruct the growth of Islam in their colonies. But they realized they could not do it. They realized it was impossible. The French developed all kinds of discourses against Islam, but the French turned around and embraced Muslim leaders because what did they want? Stability. They wanted peace. They wanted order. And they realized they would not be able to achieve order if they continue to marginalize Muslims. And in the meantime, the Muslim population was growing. Because what colonialism did was to almost suppress indigenous faiths. Not intentionally, but that was the outcome. Because as Muslims continued to expand into other areas and preaching and converting people, and Christian missionaries were doing the same, what happened to the African faith? The African faith began to decline. So what we call African indigenous faith today has declined significantly. People who observe only indigenous faith are now the minorities, from being the majorities, and now they are minorities. So that growth began, and it expanded during the 1970s, 1980s, when we look at the statistics, and it had in part to do with the success of missionaries, black missionaries, and also economic dislocation occurring during that time under the Cold War.
You know, it's fascinating if you Google religions in Africa, it's amazing to see how the strong population of Islam in the north, and then the Christian population in the south. I mean, it's really incredible. Can you share, like, why is that? Why did those two religions grow so large in those two areas?
Thank you very much for that question. I call it the sheep and the camel. Right. One is the camel, the other one is the sheep. The coastal areas, because Islam expanded from the north, from North Africa into West Africa, I want us to focus on the western part of Africa, from Algeria all the way down to West Africa, to Senegal, right? Islam began in the north and expanded to the West African region. So when you look at the protruding part of West Africa that is closer to the United States, you would see that even the coastal areas had more Muslims than the other areas. The Portuguese were the first to begin spreading Christianity in West Africa. And they began with the Congo. And again, here it was the Congolese rulers who saw, at that time, the Portuguese were trading in all kinds of stuff. This was before the slave trade, right? And the Congolese leaders embraced Catholicism, right? And began to spread it through what is today Congo, Angola, that part of Central African region. So the Europeans were coming from the coastal part and establishing themselves along the coast, right? And gradually spreading Christianity to the indigenous populations. So what we had was the sheep, right, bringing Christianity through the coast, moving northward, but couldn't expand further. And the camel, which was the main means of transportation in the desert, was also bringing Islam. Indeed, every time I teach history of Islam and Christianity, and I show students that map where you see Islam all the way on the north and you see Christianity at the south, I also caution them, don't assume that everyone in this column is a Muslim. There are Christians in that. It's just simple map simplicity. But there are Christians in the area that is shaded Islam, and there are Muslims in the areas that is shaded Christians.
So what would you say is the largest Christian denomination in Africa? Is it Catholic, the Catholic Church, or others? Is it a mix?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask this question. Because it's a very complicated question.
Okay.
It is very difficult today, and I've always struggled with this. One, it depends on the country, right? So when you go to the Congo, for example, Catholics still exceed evangelicals. But when you go to other parts of Africa, you find a rapid growth of the evangelical movement. One thing is for certain, the Catholic Church and the what we call the traditional churches, Anglican, Methodist, Wesleyan, they are all declining. And they are declining relative to the fastest growing Pentecostal evangelical movement. The Pentecostal evangelical movement is very strong, very aggressive, and expanding everywhere in Africa, including areas that used to be predominantly Catholic. The other reason that makes it complicated is that British territories that were once colonized by the British tend to have more Anglican and Methodist and Wesleyan institutions than the areas that were colonized by the French. So French territories, Portuguese territories, former Portuguese territories, former French territory still have a larger population of Catholics. But when you come down to the territories that were once under British rule, it is the Anglican Church in particular that was growing. But having said that, everywhere you go, and I'm generalizing here, every country that one goes to in Africa, south of the Sahara, wherever you find a Catholic church, wherever you find the Catholic, Methodist, and the rest, will also find other faiths. So Africa, I emphasize, in terms of religion, we are very pluralistic.
You know, you mentioned about the rise of Pentecostalism in Africa. That's also happening significantly, as you know, in South America. Yes. The Pentecostal church is just growing and growing. What is it about that Pentecostal charismatic tradition that you think is so attractive to Africans and to Latin Americans?
I like that question. And the answer is simple. I think the evangelical movement is more practical and less ritual than the established churches. The Pentecostal movement speaks to the people. They speak to individuals. They tell them, you are poor, and you are poor because the government is not doing what it's supposed to do. You are poor, but Christ can make you rich. And if you're not rich on this earth, you will be rich in the hereafter. They are very strong in advising their people to spread the message within their families, even though in some instances they polarize families, because we know members of the evangelicals would not accept you if you're not one of them. Okay. So when they try to preach and you reject them, they abandon you. And in some cases, it creates friction. But my answer to the question is that the charismatic Pentecostal movement is very practical. They offer healing of people's health conditions. They make all kinds of promises, and I don't question the veracity of their promises, but I observe the effectiveness of their message.
Interesting. All right, so I have a question. It's a huge question, which you could teach a whole course and write books on this. So I want to see what you can say is, what has been the history of Christianity and Islam relationship in Africa, and what's the current state of the relationship between Islam and Christianity?
That is not a very difficult question.
Oh, okay.
And I say it's not a difficult question because I began by identifying myself, right? So I think there are many folks like me who believe in religious coexistence. The relationship between Islam and Christianity had almost historically been coexistent, pluralistic. So, and I'm going to explain it. I mentioned European colonizers earlier. When Europeans began to expand into Africa, especially West Africa, which has the highest density of Muslims in the entire continent, including North Africa. West Africa has more densely populated Muslims than the North. When Europeans expanded into those territories, the people they confronted were Muslims. So Muslims fought to protect their territories against colonization. Of course, they lost. The response of the colonialists was, we won the war, but how do we win the peace? And the way to win the peace is to embrace Muslims and to have allies among Muslims. And those allies were able to give what the colonialists wanted, which is stability, and the colonialists left them alone to expand their faith in areas that were once non-Islamic. They allowed them to travel, as long as they don't break the laws. They allowed them to travel freely and to preach freely. In the course of this, of course, many European colonizers in West Africa in particular saw the missionaries as potential troublemakers. Because if they were to leave the missionaries, of course, with the support of the colonial administration to expand into Muslim territories, there's going to be war. So colonialists made attempts, and they were quite successful, in negotiating the relationship between Muslims and Christians, without necessarily doing so on paper, right? So the relationship was cordial. The other aspect of this coexistence was also education. Western secular education was offered to Africans by missionaries, right? So many who went to the mission school, some of course were converted to Christianity, but many who went to mission schools came back to their communities and speak quite nicely about their experiences in mission school. I just mentioned my case, right? And there are many like me. So the relationship has been very cordial. When one looks at the history of the two faiths in Africa, one would hardly find a good example of religious war that Muslims and Christians were fighting, except in one place. And that one place is Nigeria. Nigeria is almost always an exception. But even in the case of Nigeria, as you rightly pointed out, we can spend a whole semester on this question. Because even in the case of Nigeria, it was actually more recent. Because I lived in Nigeria for 1 year, on the eastern part of Nigeria, which is predominantly Christian. And I learned from those folks that until the Nigerian Civil War in 1967, their forefathers lived among Muslims peacefully and no conflict whatsoever. So the Muslim-Christian conflict that we experience in Nigeria, and any Nigeria would tell you, it's either stimulated by politicians or by pastors or Muslim priests who want to promote a vision that is not realistic. It also has to do with poverty and competition over limited resources. So, for example, you find Christians in the South dismissing Muslims in the North as exploiting the resources of the South. Because it is in the South that you have oil, you have cocoa, you have all those resources. In other places, you look at Senegal, right? Predominantly, almost 92% Muslims. The Catholics in Senegal have no problem with their Muslim brethren. You might go into a household, part of someone in the family is Catholic, others are Muslims, and they coexist. That is also true when we look at southwestern part of Nigeria, with the Yoruba state. The Yoruba ethnic group is perhaps one of the most pluralistic ethnic groups. I always tell my friends who come from that part of the world, within one household you find someone who is observing indigenous African faith. You find a Catholic, you find a Pentecostal, you find all of them. They blend. Now, having said that, I do not want to dismiss the fact that there are occasional conflicts that are defined wrongly, from my opinion and experience, wrongly as religious conflicts. They are not religious conflicts, they are cultural, they are sociological or political conflicts.
Interesting. Can you just say something briefly about the Coptic church, the Coptic tradition in Christianity, where they're from, how large?
Well, the Coptic faith is very interesting. The Coptic faith, we know, is Egypt, Ethiopia, predominantly, right? The Coptic church was not an evangelical church. It was not a mission-oriented church.
Right.
And therefore, they did not expand beyond what is today Ethiopia, right? They very carefully guarded their faith. And that is also true of Egypt, right? And indeed, Syria and part of Lebanon also have the Coptic church. So the Coptic church was the oldest Christian denomination in Africa. But it is also the one that had lagged behind all the other faiths in terms of growth, precisely because it was not a mission-oriented faith.
Interesting.
Islam is a mission-oriented faith. Therefore, everywhere they go, they preach and they convert. Christianity is a mission-oriented. Everywhere they go, they preach. Christianity here in general, but the Coptic church did not.
That's interesting, because the Coptic church, would you say, is it's very indigenous African Christian church.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I would say yes. I would say if one is looking for an Africa-centered Christian denomination, it is the Coptic Church.
Coptic.
Because the Coptic Church began when 44 AD, since during the time of Apostle Mark, when the Coptic Church began in Egypt and then spread to Ethiopia and became the state religion of the Ethiopian Empire for a very long time. Till today, the Coptic Church is defined as the royal family. It used to be the state religion. Of course, now, with the new configuration of faiths in Ethiopia, they do not make that kind of claim. For the sake of stability, they do not make that kind of claim. But it used to be the official religion of the Ethiopian state.
That's interesting. There's this tradition, right, that Mark, who wrote the gospel, went to Africa, right? There's a tradition that the Mark and the Markan community traveled to Africa. We also have in the book of Acts the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, right? And that there's a tradition that he also brought the faith, the Christian faith, to Africa. That's interesting.
But maybe, I don't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, no.
I think it would be fair for us to push it back in time before Christianity. Before Christianity, people of Ethiopia practiced which religion?
Judaism?
Judaism. Since Ethiopia mentioned Abyssinia, right? Mentioned in the Bible, right? Embraced Judaism. The tradition of Judaism, not Judaism as a faith as such, from the time that I want to mention, since the time of King Solomon.
Interesting.
Since the time of King Solomon. In fact, Ethiopians would claim that their royalty has a direct lineage with King Solomon.
Interesting.
So, do we remember the airlifting of Ethiopian Jews to Israel in the 1990s?
Interesting.
When, during the famine, actually late 1980s, during the famine in 1984, Israel made effort to move out some of the Ethiopian Jews, Phalestian Jews, I think they are called, from Ethiopia back to Israel. So people of Ethiopia, at least the royal family of the Haile Selassie, do make the claim that their lineage is with King Solomon. And therefore, before the Coptic Church was, of course, Judaism.
Right. All right, we're going to open it up for questions in about 2 or 3 minutes, so get your questions ready. I'll come around. What would you say after Islam and Christianity, what would be the third largest religion? I've read maybe Buddhism, maybe? Hinduism, possibly?
There are Hindus and Buddhists in a number of African countries, but their population is not as big when you look at the statistics.
Right, okay.
And both faiths also tend to be nationality-oriented. So it is usually people, either Indians and Chinese, right, who live in those countries that frequent those faiths, even though recently there have been conversions. So you see a few Africans in those faiths. I would say, when I teach, the rank is Christianity and Islam, almost 50-50. Mm-hmm. And below them is the indigenous faiths. Okay. Because the indigenous faith has not disappeared completely. Okay. It still exists, and there are individuals who are in both Islam and Christianity who still practice indigenous faiths as well.
Okay, all right. Well, let's open it up for questions. I'm gonna, I think, excellent, thank you. Yeah, why don't you, that'd be great, thank you.
Hello and welcome. We just left our
Can you put it closer to your mouth?
We just left the television before we came here, and right now Israel is being bombed by Iran and Lebanon. What is behind this hate Why do they hate Israel so much? I don't understand what's causing this war.
That's an excellent question, but I'm going to table that for now because I want the conversation to focus on just Africa and world religions of Africa. Someone else. Yep, in the back here.
No, I was curious, were you born and raised in Africa before you moved to the Bronx?
Yes, thank you for asking me to clarify that. Yes, I was
Which
born.
country?
I was born in Ghana and grew up in Ghana. I lived in different parts of the country. And then I came to the United States a couple of years after I completed high school to continue with my college education. So I came to the Bronx when I was about 22 years old.
And I just want to make an additional comment. You talked about going to Christian schools, but getting a secular education. I'm originally from India. I'm a Hindu, but I went to a Catholic school my entire life. And there was no religious training. We were there for education.
Yes.
And we were taught moral science,
Yes.
not the Christian religion. So that exists in India as well.
Interesting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Someone else. Have it right over here.
In America, you can always spot a Muslim by what they wear. In Africa, does Christianity and Islam change their cultures any, or do they stick to the traditional African cultures?
That's another very good question. It used to be that in most of Africa, when you see someone wearing like what I'm wearing, you could tell that person is a Muslim. No longer so. Because today, in West Africa in particular, this is an outfit of West African Muslims. But as a result of our religious and cultural pluralism, non-Muslims could wear this, and politicians have started been doing it, and therefore allow the culture to kind of blend so that people are not identified by what they wear, right? And that is also true about East Africa. So I would say Christianity and Islam were somehow appropriated by Africans. They were the selective appropriation, right? But in terms of cultural transformation, cultural differences, I don't think either Christianity or Islam transformed any African cultures as such.
Interesting. Thank you. Good question. Someone else. Any other questions? Any other questions? Yes. Right over here, Pat.
Salaamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
I know that the women wear hijabs
Yes.
and burqas. I don't know the name of your hat. What is the name of your hat?
That's a very good question. In fact, I don't know what it's called. In my language, it's called fulla, right? Its origin is not West Africa. Its origin is a blend of Pakistani, Morocco, right? And it's one of the Pakistani, India, Morocco, that part of the world, which were appropriated by Africans. This one that I'm wearing, actually it says made in Morocco, right? But there are a lot of them. Now, do I need to wear this? Not necessarily. But I think I respect this group so much, I decided to look in the my religious culture in order to identify my location, instead of wearing a shirt and tie. A suit and a tie. I wanted you all to see me as to who I am. An African Muslim living in Columbus for almost 2 decades, living in the United States for almost 4 decades.
Thank you.
Have the Quran and the Bible been translated into various African languages?
Very good question. I would say yes or no. More so with the Bible. The Bible has been translated in many, many African languages. In fact, it was the earliest mission endeavor we call it translating the Bible, right? There's actually a book that describes that process where missionaries wanted Africans to understand the Bible in their own language, within their own culture. But most of the translations, even though supervised by European missionaries, were done by Africans themselves. There are very few translations of the Quran into indigenous or native African languages. You know, Muslims are very particular about the translation of the Quran. So in the Hausa language, predominantly northern Nigerian language, which is huge and spoken in Ghana and other places, yes, there is a Hausa version of the Quran, right? But often the imams would not endorse it because of accuracy.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
That's actually an important distinction between Islam and Christianity of their sacred texts, where in Christianity, there's a desire for the Bible to be translated in the language of the people of the group. And in Islam, I believe, there's an expectation for people to learn Arabic in order to learn the more authentic translation or written word of the Quran.
That is very true. Yeah. That is very true. But with Islam as well, at different levels. At one level of the rituals, what is often required by a new convert is to learn a few shorter chapters of the Quran to use in the daily rituals in the 5-day prayers, right? And the expectation, as you rightly pointed out, is that the person would continue to grow. Islam often encourages continuous acquisition of knowledge, right, including the religious knowledge. And one way to do it is through learning the Arabic language.
That's also, I think, similar in Judaism, where they're encouraged to learn Hebrew. And that's very unique, I think. That's one thing that makes Christianity and its sacred text distinct from Judaism and Islam. Yeah. Someone else, any other questions? Good questions. Over here, yes.
One of the characteristics of Christianity in Africa that I've observed is that there are some deep divisions in Christian churches, the Catholic Church, Anglicans, Methodism, over social issues like sexuality and what have you. There seems to be, the African churches seem to be much more on the conservative, whatever conservative and liberal means these days, but on the conservative side of issues like that. Is there something in African culture that would explain that tendency toward the conservative side on those issues?
How do I answer this very big question? Would you allow me to simplify? I would say, if I can simplify this very complex question, I would say that African indigenous faiths and most African cultures tend to be very conservative. For the most part, they tend to be very conservative. Now, having said that, there is also a level at which there are many of the Pentecostal movement, for example, endorse very conservative views about social issues, right? One, many of their sponsors, of course, come from the United States. This we know in terms of the statistics. So when you look at this, there was this issue about homosexuality in Uganda, for example. It was the Christian American evangelical movement that were pushing for that social policy and encouraging their groups not to allow the passing of homosexuality laws. So some of these conservative ideas, in part, is African, indigenous African. It's also, in part, the sponsorship of born-again evangelical Pentecostal movements.
Interesting. Thank you. Yes.
Are the followers of Islam in Africa mainly part of the Sunni sect, or do you also have Shia Muslims? And if so, is there much conflict between the two?
That is a very good question. When I was growing up in Ghana, and I had the opportunity to travel across the West African sub-region, during that time, I would say almost 99% of West African Muslims were of Sunni Maliki brand. Sunni Maliki. One hardly heard of Shiaism. In fact, I came to this country to learn about Shiaism. I didn't know about it. But today, Shiaism is growing in West Africa, in some specific countries. And this is a more recent phenomenon. I would say starting from about the past 30 years or so, right? When you go to places where Shiaism did not exist, such as Ghana, the Ahlul Bayt Shia group established the first Muslim university in the country back in 2001. So you can see the examples of the expansion of Shiaism. However, when you go to Southern Africa or the Eastern African coast or part of Northern Africa, yes, you do have smaller populations of Shia. When you look at the entire African continent, I would say the entire African continent, in terms of demography, it is the Sunni that dominates.
In 60 seconds, what's the difference between Sunni and Shiite Islam?
I would say politics.
Politics?
That is what I always tell my students. The division, the schism between the Sunnis and the Shia was the result of politics. It was the refusal of the people of Mecca to allow Prophet Muhammad's cousin Ali to become the caliph after Muhammad had passed on. So they allowed the first generation, which was passed, the caliphate, the leadership was passed to Abu Bakr, and then it was passed on to Umar, and the supporters of Ali were becoming very nervous. When it was the time after Umar had passed on, it was Ousman who came to the throne, and at the time of Ousman, they became very annoyed, and of course, the group that would become the party of Ali began to grow, and they, according to the sources, were responsible for assassinating Ousman, right, and passing it. And then there was a civil war between the party of Ali and those who claimed to be the Sunnis. So I would say politics, with very limited aspect of the rituals as Shiaism develops.
Interesting. Thank you. Any other final?
And by the way, I use politics because I'm a historian, right? We want to see antecedents. And that is why I go back to that time period to trace the division and, of course, the practice. Thank you.
Dr. Kobo, years ago there were problems with female genital mutilation. Is that history now, or is that one of the indigenous religions' creeds,
Customs,
substances?
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. I would say it's more of a custom than a religion, right? It's an ancient custom, which is very complicated. We can spend a whole semester on this. But to answer your question more straightforward, I would say that it is declining rapidly. I grew up in a household where this was practiced. And I learned one thing. People tend to say that this is promoted by Islam. No, absolutely not. It was not promoted by Islam. Rather, it pre-existed Islam and remained to be practiced by people who converted to Islam. The very motto, those who were driving this custom, were the older generation, the older women, who still had the mentality that if my daughter doesn't remain a virgin, she will not, or my grandchild wouldn't be married, right? It was rather the older folks who were promoting this. So one time I was asked by USAID that what kind of recommendation do I give to suppress this practice? And I said, go to the older women, educate them, tell them the effect of this, which they've not been paying attention. And it had been very effective, by the way, because the older generation tend to be more conservative, right? They tend to be more resilient as far as culture is concerned. They tend to want to pass on the culture to the next generation. And sometimes they don't pay close attention to its effect. Nothing about older folks. I'm more than 60, so I can understand that. But culturally, in my society in particular, I saw those who were pushing for that practices to be my grandparents.
Dr. Kobo, do you have any final thoughts you want to share with us today as we wrap up?
My final thought is to express my gratitude for allowing me to spend some time with you this afternoon. It is an honor. You don't have to listen to me, right? But for your time, I very much appreciate it. And I look forward to re-engaging with all of you sometime in the future. I am now inviting myself.
Dr. Ousman Kobo.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're going to stand in the back, so please do greet Dr. Kobo on the way out. Why don't you, how about that? Just keep it on for now. Turn it off. Just press the button once.
It's just,
I'll take this. I'll take that. Press the button once on your.
I think it's still on.
Yeah, just click on it once. And do a testing.
Testing,
It's
testing.
still on.